Hello, everyone, and back again. So we're going to move the conversation now, as you see, to climate impact fieldwork. And as with other panels, I won't introduce the speakers in long form, but I'm joined here by Diana Pardue from the National Park Service down at the Statue of Liberty, Liberty National Monument, Vincent Beltran from the Getty Conservation Institute, Kat Dunn, who's joining us on screen, I guess, from Scotland, and Aaron Leggett from the Anchorage Museum, Alaska. So as I said in my introduction, I wanted to move the conversation from thinking about how the climate crisis is impacting each of us as individuals, and thinking about our curatorial practice, and actually in that final response to Anne Marie's question, Professor Atkinson talked about storytelling, and I think all of us as curators can understand that some of our responsibility is to present information in ways that our audiences can understand what's happening, and we're all handling that in different ways. And so I want to begin, so each of our panelists is going to make a short presentation, and then we'll continue with some questions from myself and among the panelists, and then we'll go out to a Q&A. So I wanted to begin with Diana to talk about the work she's been doing with the International Council of Museums, ICOM. She's one of the US representatives to the Sustainability Working Group. And I wanted to take this conversation from that kind of big global project, and then sort of go deeper into individual curatorial practice. So Diana.
Okay.
I think it's on.
Great. I had some slides, I think. Here we go. So I'm Diana Pardue. I work for the National Park Service, but I'm also a member of ICOM, which is the International Council of Museums that some of you may be familiar with. And about 5 years ago, they decided to create a working group on sustainability to start looking at how museums of all different types could address sustainability and climate change.
Sorry, excuse me. I
Okay.
have slides.
Oh, okay.
So you tell me
Yeah.
when to change.
So
Okay.
can I have the next slide? Okay, so ICOM has a triennial meeting every 3 years, and the last meeting was in Kyoto in 2019. And as a result of this conference, they developed this resolution on sustainability. And this, I wanted to just really quickly go over with you, because this gives you an idea of what they're focusing on, that's sort of a framework. And this is our next triennial will be taking place this summer in Prague. And so we will be discussing this, as well as hopefully having another resolution for the next 3 years. So basically what it says is, considering humanity's current demands on the planet are unsustainable, the planet and all of its inhabitants, human and non-human, are facing an entangling sense of unprecedented environmental and societal crises, the impact of which rising inequality, wars, poverty, climate change, and loss of biodiversity are serving to amplify these crises. So the 34th General Assembly is recommending that ICOM and its committees, alliances, affiliated organizations, and its secretariat, which is its central office in Paris, that they're recognizing that all museums have a role to play in shaping and creating a sustainable future through all our various programs and operations. and endorsing the urgent call by the Working Group for Sustainability that museums respond by rethinking and recasting their values, missions, and strategies, and then become familiar with and assist in all ways possible the goals and targets of the UN's SDGs, and use the 2030 Transforming Our World agenda as a guiding framework to incorporate sustainability into our internal and external practices and educational programming, and then empowering ourselves, our visitors, our communities through making positive contributions to achieving the goals of Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World, acknowledging and reducing our environmental impact, including our carbon footprint, and helping secure a sustainable future for all inhabitants of the planet, human and non-human. Can I have the next slide? And just to refresh in your mind, the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN established a number of years ago. And this is sort of the framework that museums can use to create their own plan for 2030, so to see how they can reduce their carbon footprint and achieve some of these goals that have been defined as sustainable development goals. Next slide. So some of the ideas from the working groups as to how museums can achieve this is one of the things they've talked about in ICOM is having museums have to give there's annual reports that the national committees and international committees have to do every year, but that they would, as part of this annual report, that they would include some type of reporting on how they've accomplished their sustainability goals, what their goals are, and how they've achieved them. And then one of the big things is talking about creating low carbon, low waste events and conferences, and make this a norm rather than an exception. Encouraging museums to address carbon footprints and waste. And there's a whole number of ways that this can be done through different types of checklists and looking at working with architectural groups to measure carbon footprints and waste and see how you can reduce it. And then, of course, I think all museums are trying to generate more youth involvement, but this is something that the youth is very interested in, and it's a way of bringing more youth into our museums. Expand capacity to engage with underrepresented countries, peoples, and address language barriers. And this is important in ICOM because it represents museums from all continents. And the way museums in the Southern Hemisphere view sustainability is very different from the way that museums in the northern part of the world view it. And so they're one of the interesting things at ICOM is the conversations that are now going back and forth between the northern and southern areas of the world and how the museums would deal with these things. And then one idea was to create a sustainable database for all museums, something that museums could look to. So these are just some of the ideas that this working group has come up with. And I encourage you to think about these things and maybe think what other things you might be able to do in your own museum and community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. And of course, go to the ICOM site and reach out to
I
us.
think I have one more.
Yes. Oh, one more slide.
Slide. This is just to give you a little information about ICOM if you don't already know, but go ahead.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to our second panelist, Vincent Beltran, who's joining us from the Getty Conservation Institute. Vincent.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. A lot of the work that I do at the Getty Conservation Institute falls under the umbrella of the Managing Collection Environments Initiative, or MCE in short. This initiative started in about 2012 and examines research questions and practical issues about the sustainable control and management of the collection environments in museums. And the cartoon that you see on the screen illustrates the initiative's scope and ideals. If we start at the top, at the crow's nest at the top of the mast, MCE combines research and field work to explore the response of artist materials to environmental change. And our hope is that this work will help illuminate the path forward for the heritage conservation field. MCE then seeks to disseminate this information via courses, workshops, and experts meetings, as evidenced by the passage of information from the crow's nest to the stern. And this informs the development of environmental guidance and policy that sets the direction for the field. Finally, this evidence-based guidance and policy is implemented by the skilled and dedicated effort of collection staff, collection care staff. Slide. In some respects, the MCE initiative resembles these two girls who are focused on an irresistibly inviting gallery floor vent. To develop and identify sustainable environmental management strategies, it's important to understand both the object and its surrounding environment. And this environmental context includes things like interior and exterior temperature and RH conditions, the performance of the building envelope, and clear and transparent cross-departmental communication. So while we do very much enjoy the artwork and all of the wonderful stories you all tell, we're also trying to look for different kinds of stories about the preservation state of the object and now and into the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Vincent. We'll come back to all of our panelists. So I'm going to invite into the conversation Kat Dunn, who's joining us from Glasgow, I believe. And Kat, I will advance your slides, so just tell me when.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm currently sitting in Glasgow in Scotland. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice, which is as a freelance social justice curator, and I'm going to specifically speak about Harbinger exhibition, which I created and coincided with COP26 last year. As someone from a marginalized community, I was really interested in why no one were actually bringing the voices into the conversation. There was lots of government bodies meeting here in Glasgow, obviously for COP26, lots of actors and actresses coming in, but no one actually spoke about the people who were predominantly affected. And I wanted to create an exhibition around that. So Harbinger, next slide, please, sorry. So this was the poster that went up that we created for Harbinger exhibition. It's basically made up of lots of different skin colors and eye shapes. And I wanted it to be very female because these are the people that are affected. So Harbinger is actually a research hybrid exhibition, which was done both physically within Transmission Gallery here in Glasgow, and also a digital platform was created from scratch for the exhibition. So everything that was in the physical exhibition was also in the digital format. And it investigated the climate crisis and its effect on marginalized communities, but also, and most especially, women of color. And this, we looked at everything from skin and hair. We brought in people who normally aren't really associated in these exhibitions. So we brought in scientists and we brought in skin consultants and dermatologists. And one of the things we really wanted to do was to speak to these women and get their stories. So when you go onto the website, there's actually a zine that was done predominantly by the East Asian community, because in Britain we have a term which is called BAME, which is B-A-M-E, and it stands for Black and Asian minority ethnic. However, in Britain, Asian means Indians, Pakistanis, and Sikhs. It completely ignores anyone from East Asia. And I really wanted to address that, especially with hashtag Stop Asian Hate and the things that my friends were going through throughout England and Scotland. So we decided to create this very multi-layered exhibition, which was artworks, installations, the zine, and also a series of interviews with different people. Next slide, please. So this became the most talked about aspect of the exhibition. It's the trash heap. And over, of course, in Glasgow, in Scotland, we were in lockdown like everywhere else in the world. This is the amount of garbage that was left over from 1 year, from one person. And we started collecting it at the beginning of, no, we started collecting it, sorry, at the end, so November 2020, and kept it in just used garbage bags. And majority of this is hair products and skin products, because still we were looking at the concept of being a Black or brown person still fitting into what is seen as a Eurocentric gaze, and really and truly what that means under the climate crisis. So obviously, as someone from marginalized communities, we know that the climate crisis is not just about climate change. It also has racism, racial bias, patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. And I wanted to kind of figure out how to show all of these aspects through conversation, through interaction, and be able, because we were doing it in line with COP26, for people from COP26 to be able to come into Glasgow and come to the exhibition. So in terms of footfall, over a 3-day period, we actually saw 10,000 people. And online, because it was digital and it was more far-reaching, we had people looking at us from Beijing, from China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, and even further afield, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. And the numbers for the online at last count was sitting at around 26,000 views. So this was a big thing, and majority of the views came to the trash heap. Now at the top, you will see there's an actual screen, which did work. And so we ran 4 interviews through that screen. But we really wanted the idea for people to see what a person of color, what a woman of color has to use to fit in an urban environment where you just don't feel that you can actually be yourself. And if you actually look at the interviews, a lot of people are speaking about the effect to their self-identity, and also that we've now kind of taken a stance where we're not chemically relaxing our hair, we're having natural hair, et cetera, but yet people kept going back to the trash heap. And it was really shocking when you're thinking about in terms of recycling and how this is affecting the environment, because obviously we use chemicals on our skin, on our hair, and it goes down the drain. You don't think about it anymore, really. But one of the scientists that we had was talking about the idea of these chemicals, going through the soil, affecting the vegetation, and also eventually reaching the water table. So we really kind of took that apart and examined that and the consequences and what it meant. So to be in lockdown, where you're literally possibly seeing people only on screen, to be able to create that amount over the course of 12 months, and then you multiply it by an entire lifetime, right? So this was really important for us to show. And it's also really shocking for us curating the exhibition when we opened up these garbage bags to create this particular installation, to see just how much one person had gone through in a year. So I would, of course, welcome you to go on to the website. It is still up, it is still live. And to just to see all the very definitions and listen to the interviews and the conversations. But for me personally, it was quite an eye-opener to be able to listen to these conversations and hear these conversations by people as to what they go through on a day-to-day basis on the climate crisis, and also that impact to climate change and what we are now having to effectively attempt to clean up. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. I'm going to move the slides along, but I'm going to, Aaron, I think I'm going to give you your,
Okay,
just the
great.
green, big green button.
The big
Thank
green
you.
button, great. Okay, hello, everybody. Again, Aaron Leggett. I'm the senior curator at the Anchorage Museum. The Anchorage Museum is the largest museum in Alaska, and we're represent art, science, history, and culture. So we take a multidisciplinary approach. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that are on view currently at the Anchorage Museum. On the third floor, counter cartographies. Living with the Land presents contemporary artworks that examine the relationship to land, proposing alternate ways of thinking about and experiencing landscape around us. Artists draw attention to the way culture, identity, emotion, ancestry, displacement, power, and colonization shape and inform our understanding of the land. One of the artists that's featured in the exhibition, Icelandic artist Ruri, investigates social, political, and environmental issues impacting human rights and the natural world. Her installation consists of two works. The one on the right you can see there is called Water Balance 3. And then the other one is Future Cartography 6, a project. In Water Balance, the artist considers the element of water from two opposing perspectives: as a sustainer of life on this planet, as well as a threat due to coastal communities due to extreme weather, flooding, sea level rise precipitated by climate change. Each glass vessel in Water Balance represents the amount of life-sustaining water available for human beings on Earth. The varying qualities of water draw attention to economic inequality and the way climate change is exacerbating these disparities. And then Future Cartography 6, the maps that you see towards the back of the image are views of North America, Iceland, and Bangladesh. And rather than showing these landscapes as we currently understand them, Ruri offers a visual study of their future shoreline with the changes in ocean level based on calculations of the mass of water that'll be released during the total melting of the Antarctic and Greenlandic glaciers and all the mountains, glaciers of the globe. Next, we see Sami artists Udi Pieski, Jenny Lati, and Niels Holmberg, and their piece is called Kiss from the Border. It's intervention in the landscape along the border between Norway and Finland. The artist placed 8 strategic lines of poetry in the Dietno River in Sapmi, the area between northern Finland and Norway. The work calls attention to issues concerning Sami sovereignty and environmental justice. And then rather than focusing on the rivers as a marker of geopolitical divide between nation states, the artist envisioned Dietno, or the Great River in Sami, as an entity within its own rights. Next, we have Lead Pencil Studio, who used LiDAR scientific data to create these 3D models, which represent an alternate representation of the 49th state, representing 3-dimensional characteristics of ice, snow, steam, cloud, and rain. Next, another exhibition we have currently up is Christina Seeley's multidisciplinary practice that stretches the field of art, science, design, and installation. And she did 2 projects here called Dissonance and Disturbance. Dissonance is a single-channel video installation showing in slow motion the melting ice from the Greenland ice sheet as the artist interacts with them. Disturbance is an immersive audio installation which shows the man-made, so actually those are flipped, audio installation of how man-made sound sources disrupt natural and ambient sound, drawing on Seaweed's fieldwork in Greenland, Alaska, Panama, and the project investigates the proliferation of global trade networks and the worsening climate impacts on the environment. Most recently, we installed the place I call home. This is photographer Jovel Rennie, and it's associated with his hometown of Anchorage, Alaska. Born in Trinidad and raised mostly in Alaska, Rennie reveals varied facets of millennial life in Alaska's largest urban center through his photographs, wild landscapes, glimpsed through the window of cars, portraits of friends, strip malls, and other parts of the city to create a process of a creative exchange, the freedom of wild spaces, and the sense of beauty that emerges when you're taking a closer look at your most intimate everyday surroundings. And the last one I want to talk about right now is Borealis, Life in the Woods. From 2016 to 2019, Jerome Torkinson visited the forest of the boreal zone throughout Alaska, Canada, Russia, and Japan, and highlighting the interaction that this area known as the boreal forest, or in Russia known as the taiga, impacts and is sort of considered to be part of the world's sort of lung system because of the carbon dioxide that these trees absorb. So here's just a couple shots of that. So that's it. So you can see, just right now what we have going on.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all of the panelists for introducing their work. So I wanted to just move on to a few questions about things that I think we share in common and that would be of interest to the work of the curators. And so I had a question to start with Diana, to actually move away from ICOM and talk. I'm just curious about how each of us has come to doing work around climate. And I wondered, being within the National Park Service and in the middle of the river, when did that process begin for parks in Ellis Island and the Liberty National Park?
Well, actually, with the Park Service has been involved very early on with environmental education. And that is something they are, I think this goes back to the 70s. They started developing educational programs for children in parks, and they have a lot of the parks in the DC area. So I would say they started off with environmental education for children, and that expanded. And it's always been part of their work, in that as each park determines, I think it's the same thing with museums, you determine what your primary mission is, and then you filter that into different initiatives that we've been involved with. And the Park Service has, from its very beginning, it was created and always had scientists on staff. So there were scientists working in parks out west, and then in different parts of the United States. So I think it's something that's sort of just an inherent part of its mission. And then they've run into issues at different points along the way, because it's a political organization where it's been, a dominant part of the United States focus, or it's not a dominant part of the United States focus, but it's always there. And if you dig deep enough, and now, we all have websites, you can find there's an enormous amount of material in the National Park Service websites on all these various issues. And there's a lot of work, scientific work that's going on using the parks as laboratories to actually monitor changes that are happening in the United States.
Great, thank you, thank you. And Vincent, I just wondered, in terms of your practice at the Getty Conservation Institute, I imagine scientists working on Renaissance paintings and ancient vases. But when did the sort of climate issue really come to the fore, or was that always part of the equation?
Yeah, I think sustainability has been an increasingly important word in the museum community. And I think it's really encapsulated. In 2014, IIC and ICOM-CC had a joint declaration on environmental guidelines. And it, identified the fact that sustainability is bigger than the discussion of environmental standards. And that sustainability needs to be an underlying criterion of all of our future principles. The thing that really hit home for us, though, was a particular clause that acknowledged that the issue of collection and material environmental requirements is complicated. And that scientists and conservators have to actively unpack these complexities. And that really is kind of a mission of the MC initiative, is to have this interdisciplinary discussion to try to understand how we can improve sustainability for cultural heritage institutions.
Thank you. And Kat, can I ask you to come in terms of when in your own practice, and I know you're in a doctoral program, did you start really thinking about making climate a primary focus?
Thanks. I've been thinking about making climate a primary focus from about 2014, when I was doing my second undergrad, because you, as an artist, and a curator, you're watching so much waste, right? And you're then looking for trying, especially in the jewelry section, because I did my second undergrad in jewelry design. And you're basically trying to figure out ways of trying to have sustainable silver, gold, or sustainable gemstones. And so that then became a thing where I got together with someone. We had a group for sustainability at Glasgow School of Art. So I got together with them and wanted to know what we could do, really. And the answer was like, well, you're a jeweler, so not really a lot. But actually, it turned out to not be true. So I've really been invested in sustainability and trying to work out how to bring that into my practice since about 2014. It definitely came to a head at the beginning of the pandemic, because you're then trying to figure out how to work on a completely different focus. And the stories that I was beginning to hear as a curator, it's really quite chilling. And I was kind of playing around with, well, how to create an exhibition to tell these stories and to show that both the climate crisis and climate change is such a massive impact to marginalized communities. So Harbinger, for instance, basically took about a year and a half, 2 years for me to actually figure out all the dynamics and all the layers of it, because I really wanted to do the people that I was telling those stories for justice.
Thank you. Thank you. And Aaron, I know we spoke earlier about your being a native of Alaska and living in that community. And I wonder the same in terms of both your just being a citizen of that geography, but also being part of the museum community. When did climate become part of your mission, museum's mission to present works and artists who are working in that area?
Well, I would say we had a change of directors in 2013 and 2014. The new director that came in, we started doing our 5-year strategic plan, and two things that came out of that strategic planning. One was strengthening our connections across the circumpolar north. So, making connections in Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia, to work with other museums and institutions, because what we found are a lot of similarities, not just in the cultures of the place, the environment of the place, but issues around indigenous representation and sovereignty in a lot of those places. So because sometimes it can feel sort of isolating, I think you sort of think like Alaska is the United States connection to the Arctic. And so we have this idea that nobody quite understands, where we're from. But when we go to these other places, we find these similarities, and we find that a lot of these artists are tackling the same issues. So it kind of got ingrained from that point, I would say. Again, it's just sort of boiled into all the work that we do. It's not, I don't know that we necessarily call it out as much, but it is a thread that runs through, every aspect of the museum.
And can I ask, and I'll ask others as well, but in terms of audience, like when you think of who is the audience for the work you're doing in the community, who would that be?
Well, there's two main audiences. Obviously, starting about this time of year through early September, we have a lot of visitors from around the world that are coming to Alaska, and the Anchorage Museum is one of the top attractions in the state for people that come to Anchorage. But for most of the year, the main audience, I would say, is the local community, and that's another sort of aspect to our strategic plan, is that it's not just what goes on in the four walls of the museum. In fact, a lot of my work is outside of the museum itself and being part of the community and doing, artist interventions and working with the university. And we have a seed lab. We've got a grant from Bloomberg Foundation to all kind of integrate into the community itself. And so I would say our main audience would be Anchorage citizens themselves, and especially also, I would say, the children of Anchorage, and educating the next generation for this place that they should care about.
Thank you. And Vincent, I know when we first spoke, we talked about some of the work that the Getty does, in doing workshops and other things. So in terms of audience, I guess other professionals who are working, conservators.
Yeah, I think our audience is broader than that. It's pretty much everyone at the museum that has a hand in trying to develop environmental management. So it is the collection care staff, but it's also the director. It's also curatorial. It's also facilities and HVAC engineers, and everyone really has to work in concert to enact this kind of change. Actually, a few years ago, we worked on the revision of the 2019 ASHRAE chapter on museums, galleries, archives, and libraries. ASHRAE is an organization geared towards HVAC engineers, but this chapter has been pretty influential in the conservation field. And something that we integrated there was a decision-making process to try to guide how you can come up with your appropriate sustainable management strategy. Embedded in that is an identification of all the stakeholders that participate during the process and how their level of responsibility varies as that process happens. And it just kind of goes to show that you're not going to do this alone. You're going to really have to do this as a team in order to be successful.
And Diana, in thinking about ICOM, and so this working group included other museum professionals, but did it also consider others, not just curators, museum directors? What was the kind of mix of people who were working through these ideas?
Yeah, it purposely included people from all the different regions of the world, because we felt like that was really important. And it was, it's museum people, but there's different types of museums. There are archaeologists, there are curators, there are architectural museums. And so it included all the various, there's, people depending on what region of the world they're from, different types, science museums, art museums, history museums, And then, like I said, the different professions or different specialties.
And when this protocol or report that will come out at the next triennial of ICOM, the audience is intended to be museum everyone's.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, it's purposely for members of ICOM, but in putting all these things together, we didn't exclude anyone whose museum, or if they were not personally a member of ICOM. And there's just, we tried to work with everybody who was interested. And in a lot of countries, there are very specific sustainability groups. There's a lot of, and then there were a lot of conferences that took place in Europe, in China. China has a lot of sustainability things going on, and then in South America. So it's a whole range of things and a whole range of audiences. And also trying to work with indigenous populations that are involved in museums in Australia and some other places.
Thank you. And I asked these questions because I think as curators, right, we're learning, we learned, we practice this, that we're not alone, and that this is a crisis that requires us to be engaged on so many levels with so many different professionals, and again, just in our own community. And so I take that now to Kat to say, in terms of, you mentioned you had 10,000 people during COP26 see the exhibition, but so what was your intention for audience?
Well, I'm originally from the Caribbean. I'm from Barbados, and I'm also obviously involved in University of Dundee. My overall thing was for it to be for a general audience. Because again, people are coming from far and wide. What surprised me, however, was we had quite a lot of scientists visiting and other curators visiting as well. So that was kind of a very specialized audience. But overall, I tend to direct my work towards the diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora audience, or just a general audience. Anyone who really wants to hear a different way of attempting to do something, or to hear of a lived experience. So that was kind of the target audience in my head when I was creating the exhibition, but actually we ended up getting, like I said, a very quite specialized audience that came directly from COP26. And then we also had a general audience as well.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask, in terms of the work you're doing, I thought it was interesting listening to Professor Atkinson, thinking about the mental health crisis, but also just thinking about young people. And Diana mentioned in the ICOM information that there's a specific attention on young people as we look forward in our museums, who will be our next museum goers. And I just wondered, are any of you, I mean, anyone can answer this, this idea of presenting this material in your museums in a way that is action-oriented, or, not frightening, I guess is the word, because I think we're all, after the pandemic, aware of mental health issues, well-being, and do any of you have examples of programs where people are introduced to these ideas, but done in a way that provides some kind of hope, action steps? And Aaron, maybe like in terms of your gallery, your museum, are there opportunities in terms of programming for people to come in and address these issues, how they're feeling, how the impacts are?
Well, I don't know that there's one specifically, again, directed right to climate change per se. It's more about taking elements from each one of these exhibitions and kind of, expanding out on various topics and themes. I think for us, what we feel strongly about is that we want to work towards having solutions. And one of the ways to have solutions is to have an informed citizenry about these topics. I think, there's so many misunderstandings about Alaska as being either this resource-rich place that's there to be, exploited and developed, or that it's this pristine, untouched landscape that, no humans have set foot in these gardens of Eden, so to speak. And neither of those are completely true. And so we're constantly wrestling with that idea. And it also takes away the agency that people have lived in these places, in some cases for thousands of years. And how do we find ways to incorporate indigenous knowledge, sustainability that is not based, I guess, in fear, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's important. And Vincent, in terms of that, in terms of like when you're doing workshops and talking to other conservation professionals, I mean, there must be a lot of anxiety around these issues and the changing, climates and how it's going to affect their collections. So how is that, handled?
Yeah, well, there definitely are anxieties, and I think that's why people are so interested in engaging and to see what kind of actions we can take. To speak to your comment about trying to marry kind of the institutional action to climate change, there's a great example, and I'll kind of give the context first. In 2008, the BISO group, which is comprised of directors of large museums, that they adopted something called the BISO Green Protocol, which offered a strategy of trying to shift away from tight environments around 78% or 70 Fahrenheit, 50% RH, towards broader temperature and RH ranges for many types of object types. The National Gallery of Victoria in Australia, they were highly motivated by energy savings and energy security, as well as like moral imperative to become more sustainable. And they sought to voluntarily widen their environment in many of its galleries. NGV is also part of the BISO group, and it's actually one of the few institutions that's actively trying to implement the BISO Green Protocol. So having this environmental transition gave us a great opportunity to examine the mechanical response of key objects to this expanding temperature and RH field. So the NGV and the GCI were collaborating to assess the response of one particular keystone object. It's a 16th century Flemish retablo, and for using something called acoustic emission monitoring, which in essence is a highly sensitive microphone placed on an object to hear energy released from microcracking events. The fact that the microphone is extremely sensitive allows us to detect change before it's visible, which is key. So it allows us to inform the implementation of the strategy. Our expectation is that the object is going to remain completely silent during the expansion of this temperature and RH range. But what's great is that this acoustic emission monitoring that's actively working isn't being hidden. It's alongside that object, and it's a part of the narrative of that object, of that room, of that institution. And it really tries to engage the audience to understand the impacts of climate change and what actions are trying to be taken.
That's an incredibly rich example. Thank you. So I've gotten the little pink slip, which means we're heading towards Q&A. And so I invite those of you who are here in the room or online to send in your questions or come up to the microphone.
So I have a question from our virtual audience. Thank you for these interesting presentations that show how contemporary artists are engaging with the climate crisis. In your institutions, are historic collections also being used to discuss these critical issues?
Anybody want to take that? I guess it means in terms of curatorial practice. using historical objects rather than contemporary art practitioners?
Yeah, one of the components that I worked on for counter cartographies was looking at our historic map collection and how, again, that shapes our narrative. It also documents, various colonial practices and draws attention to it. The size of objects, kind of putting a critical eye towards those things and how perceptions of our place are largely dictated by those documents and things that exist from the past.
Thank you. Any other questions from our audience?
So I'd like to
Okay.
add to that real quick.
Oh, sure.
So something that we do often try to examine our older objects and their preservation state relative to the environmental conditions that they've been exposed to. And I think it's important to not forget that these objects have been exposed to a lot. And the desire to maintain an extremely tight environment for an object that's seen much greater fluctuations may not really be necessary for the majority of objects. Key objects, particularly objects that have undergone conservation treatment, that kind of like resets the environmental history of the object. But it's always good to look at the objects themselves and recognize that they already have kind of built in their history and their ability to respond to the environment.
Hi, I also had a question for Vincent. I appreciated your point that these conversations are really a collective conversation from the museum director and collection care staff, facility staff and curators. And I'm curious what, speaking to an audience of curators, what do you feel is the thing that you think you wish curators really take away from this, either this conversation or additional research? What is there kind of low-hanging fruit for curators to to be activists for their own institutions in terms of changes to make their institutions more sustainable, their own practices more sustainable around exhibition making, collection care in their own galleries? What do you think curators, really need to become better informed about in order to participate in that conversation productively?
Well, I think this example of the NGV really incorporating kind of the science and the actions into the storytelling, I think is super helpful. It's just a way to really spread the kind of the work that we're doing and actually to lead other institutions. I know, institutions like the NGV or at the Getty Museum were quite big, and we're often seen as kind of bellwethers for the field. And, a lot of historic museums are already dealing with these issues and maybe are trying to maintain tight environments that bigger museums are, maybe it's easier for them to do, but maybe not so necessary. So if we can turn the tables and have the bigger institutions kind of seek out broader ranges, it can start providing influence to the rest of the field. I think to your question, I think the curatorial role is just to be integrated into this team that's happening at each of your institutions. And everyone's going to play a role in terms of trying to make the institution more sustainable. So it's this communication across departments that I think is key to really having effective change.
Thank you. Do we have time for another question?
Thank you all for introducing us to this different perspective on our role in addressing climate change and climate grief, as we learned. But we talked a lot about audiences, and I'm interested actually if there are examples, goes to the whole panel, of the sort of, a desire or the need for museums to address those issues or address their own role in sustainability questions that come from audiences, sort of come to the institutions from outside, and then inspired or triggered museums to take action.
Kat, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to say something?
I keep forgetting I'm on a big screen. Yes, I work quite collaboratively. And one of the things that came out from Harbinger was the fact that the undergrad students had quite a lot of questions about the exhibition. So what I did was to work with the University of Dundee, and we created a workshop based around Harbinger, where I gave a presentation, but then we started to break it down. And we used the questions that the students had submitted in order to create the workshop, so that they were, in a weird way, almost helping to answer their own questions. So the workshop was, again, a hybrid one where it was physical and digital, because that's how I tend to work. And so we had everyone kind of interacting to kind of come up with solutions that we could take forward as a cohort. So we're talking undergrad, master's, and PhD students, and also lecturers were involved in this. And about 85 people came to it initially, but then we ran a second one, which was significantly more. And now some of those suggestions that came up during the workshop are actually being indoctrinated back into the university and also into the curatorial team as well.
Thank you. Thank you. How are we doing on time? Are we out of time? Okay, so thank you, Kat, for joining us from, we out of time. Can we take one more question? Okay, short question, short answer. Thank you.
Thank you. This has really been insightful. I think for a lot of communities of color, they're still grappling with the kind of environmental inequities that exist within their communities, and how to get them to really think about the larger when they're so focused on the quality of life that they have. So Kat, I love a lot of your strategies that you've brought to the fore. My question is, do you know of artists? Can you think of other strategies that get into the communities that allow them to see and connect the dots between the issues that they're having in their communities about, things like concrete crushing plants within their residential areas or trash heaps within, and allowing them to connect those issues with the larger environmental issues?
Thank you. Yes. Again, what we've done is the conversation was so rich for Harbinger, and also so traumatic as well, so jarring. Because as you said, we're so busy trying to just survive, right? So what we did was we held a series of workshops. And as I said, I work very collaboratively. So I worked with artists in Scotland, Ashanti Harris and Sakai Machachi, who are quite good friends of mine. And we really brought the community in. And that was one of the reasons that we also use Transmission Gallery, because it tends to only show for marginalized communities. But one of the things that we did, or one of the things I did to get people to start being invested in the wider conversation, was we held a series of workshops in places that workshops normally aren't. So think of the barber shop. And we did a rooftop garden conversation where we created vegetables for a high rise. And in doing that, we started the conversation that way. We started to talk about, what would you do if you were able to leave? How do you see yourself in the community? How do you see yourself as you live in an urban environment? And these conversations then started more conversations, and we brought in elements from other institutions, such as Empower Women for Change, which is a institution here in Glasgow that works with refugee women. So we brought in these kind of people, and we literally did things that hadn't been done before. And personally, I hate heights, but there I was on top of a roof creating a garden, because I think it is important to get that conversation started, to get the idea started that this is part of a larger something.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you all to the panelists for being here in person. And we're going to have a short break, and then we continue with one more component of this, which is the conversation between Jane Winchell from the Peabody Essex Museum and artist Xavier Cortada. So thank you. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you.